single gunshot shattered the freezing Montana blizzard, echoing right on the porch of an isolated cabin. A young, arrogant deputy had just fired a warning shot at a freezing, homeless old woman. He didn't know the cabin belonged to a combat-scarred Navy SEAL, or that the frail woman clutched the folded flags of her two fallen sons against her chest. And he certainly didn't expect a massive German shepherd to leap from the shadows, choosing to protect a total stranger. Hello friends, I'm Wilder. I've spent 55 years out here in the wild, where I've learned that animals often show more humanity than we do. Sit by the fire as I share a tale of a storm, a gold star mother, and a dog's unbreakable loyalty. Where are you listening to this story from tonight? Let me know in the comments below, and please hit subscribe to keep our campfire burning. The Bitterroot Valley in Montana does not just experience winter, it endures it. On a late December afternoon, the sky bruised itself into a deep, unforgiving shade of purple and gray, unleashing a blizzard that quickly swallowed the small town of Pine Ridge whole. The wind howled through the pines like a wounded animal, burying the asphalt roads and freezing the breath in your lungs before you could even exhale. It was the kind of brutal, bone-snapping cold that drives every living creature to seek the warmth of a hearth. But out here in the wild, I've learned that not everyone has a hearth to go to. Sometimes, the coldest place isn't the forest, it's the society you leave behind. Walking directly into the teeth of that storm was Clara. Clara was 72 years old, though the deep, harsh lines etched into her weathered face made her look much older. She was a frail bird of a woman, thin and fragile, swallowed up entirely in a patchwork of oversized, threadbare coats that offered absolutely no defense against the biting wind. There was a time, many years ago, when Clara's eyes held the bright, warm spark of a beloved kindergarten teacher, a woman who baked cookies, wiped away children's tears, and had a home filled with laughter. But that spark had been violently extinguished by a devastating fire, a tragedy that burned down her home and left her mind fractured, wandering the streets like a ghost the town preferred not to see. Yet, despite her frailty, there was an iron grip in her frost-bitten, trembling fingers. She clutched a worn, faded canvas bag tightly to her chest, right over her heart. Inside that bag lay her entire world, the neatly folded, triangular American flags of her two fallen sons. That unimaginable loss had left her adrift, but it also gave her a stubborn, silent will to endure. Right now, her only desire was driven by a desperate, singular instinct, to find a place to hide, to survive just one more night against the freezing grip of the storm. Behind her, pushing aggressively through the knee-deep drifts, was Deputy Marcus Vance. Vance was 26 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with the clean-cut, sharp-jawed look of a man who spent far more time admiring his uniform in the mirror than trying to understand the heavy responsibility of the badge pinned to his chest. He was deeply ambitious, driven by a hollow arrogance and a desperate, clawing need to impress the town's strict mayor. Vance didn't see people. He saw stepping stones and obstacles. To him, Clara was not a grieving mother or a human being in distress. She was simply an obstacle, an eyesore trespassing on private property near the edge of town, a nuisance that needed to be swept away to make the streets look pristine and orderly. Vance's patrol cruiser, its red and blue lights flashing uselessly against the blinding whiteout, was hopelessly stuck in a snowbank a mile back down the road. Furious, his pride bruised by the elements, Vance had made the reckless decision to pursue her on foot. He wanted to prove his absolute authority. He wanted to show his superiors that he was tough, uncompromising, and highly capable of handling the town's trash without calling for backup. As the snow soaked through his trousers, his frustration morphed into a dangerous anger. He didn't care about the lethal temperature dropping around them. He cared only about his ego and his absolute need to assert dominance over someone weaker than himself. The chase through the blizzard was brutal. The snow formed a blinding, swirling wall of white, effectively erasing the horizon and silencing the rest of the world. Clara stumbled repeatedly, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps that burned her throat. The cold was a physical weight, pressing down heavily on her frail shoulders, turning her limbs to lead. She was pushed to the absolute brink of human endurance, her oversized boots dragging through the heavy, unforgiving drifts. Blinded by the storm and driven by sheer terror, she crossed an invisible boundary line, leaving the town's jurisdiction and stumbling into the dense, ancient pine forest. It was a place the locals actively avoided, a deep, untamed stretch of wilderness that belonged entirely to the shadows, the predators, and the silence. Clara didn't know whose land she was trespassing on. She only knew she had to keep moving, or she would die right there in the snow. Behind her, she could hear the heavy crunch of Vance's tactical boots breaking through the ice. his angry, muffled shouts swallowed by the howling wind. He was relentless, a predator fueled by bruised pride, closing the distance. Deep within that ancient forest, completely invisible from the main road, sat a solitary, heavy-timbered log cabin. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the smell of burning cedar and absolute isolation. This was the sanctuary of Elias Thorne. Elias was 38 years old, a man carved from granite and deeply shadowed by war. He was a former Navy SEAL, standing 6'2", with a dense, dark beard and piercing, exhausted eyes that had seen far too much of the world's cruelty. Physically, he was imposing, moving around his small cabin with the quiet, lethal grace of an apex predator. But beneath the hardened muscle and the ingrained tactical precision, Elias was a fractured soul. He was locked in a daily, agonizing battle with severe PTSD, constantly fighting the ghosts of foreign battlefields and the deafening echoes of gunfire that still haunted his sleep. He had retreated to this cabin to lock the world out, terrified of the sudden rages that gripped him, choosing to live as a complete hermit to protect innocent people from the broken pieces of his own mind. He was not entirely alone in his exile, however. Resting his massive, heavy head on Elias's knee by the crackling fireplace was Kodiak. Kodiak was not just a pet, he was a lifeline. 110-pound sable-coated German shepherd, Kodiak had the thick, muscular build of a Tier 1 military working dog. His amber eyes held an ancient, quiet intelligence that seemed to understand the heavy burdens of the human heart. Kodiak was Elias's anchor, the only creature on this earth that could pull the broken soldier back from the terrifying abyss of his panic attacks. Highly trained and fiercely protective, the dog possessed a sensory awareness that bordered on the supernatural. Where Elias was guarded, volatile, and lost in his memories, Kodiak was steady, a silent, unwavering guardian who understood his master's pain without ever requiring a single word to be spoken. Outside, the winter storm reached a deafening, violent crescendo. Clara was failing rapidly, her vision blurred, the edges of the snow-covered world turning black. The cold had seeped deep into her marrow, numbing the pain in her extremities, a dangerous, silent warning that the end was near. She stumbled heavily, falling to her knees in the deep snow. She tried to rise, pushing against the freezing ground, but her legs flatly refused to obey. The canvas bag clutched to her chest felt impossibly heavy, pulling her down into the ice. And then, through the swirling white vortex of the blizzard, she saw it. A tiny, flickering square of warm orange light. A window. She dragged herself forward, inch by agonizing inch, pulling her body through the snow, fueled solely by the last dying ember of a mother's will to live. She reached the wooden steps of the cabin. With a final, agonizing surge of effort, her breath rattling in her lungs, she pulled her frail body onto the covered porch. Her frostbitten hand reached out, weakly brushing against the heavy oak door, and then the darkness finally took her. She collapsed entirely, her body hitting the wooden floorboards with a heavy, hollow thud. Inside the cabin, Kodiak's ears snapped back instantly. He didn't bark. He rose in a fluid, silent motion, his massive frame shifting immediately into a posture of absolute, focused alert. He moved swiftly to the door, a low, rumbling growl vibrating deep in his broad chest. Elias reacted with the ingrained, lightning-fast speed of a special operator. He was at the door in a heartbeat, his hand resting on the heavy iron latch, his body tense and ready for an ambush. He threw the heavy door open, the roaring wind and snow instantly biting at his face. He looked down. There, buried under layers of driving snow and ragged, frozen coats, was a fragile old woman, her face as pale as the ice itself. Elias didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. The combat-hardened soldier dropped to his knees, scooped Clara's lifeless, freezing body into his strong arms, and carried her out of the lethal storm and into the warmth of the cabin, saving her just as the blizzard threatened to swallow her whole. Kodiak did not follow them inside immediately. The massive German shepherd stepped out onto the freezing porch, completely ignoring the biting wind that whipped at his thick fur. He planted his heavy paws firmly on the wooden planks, his amber eyes piercing through the blinding snow, scanning the dark tree line. He was standing guard, a silent sentinel of the wild, watching the darkness for whatever danger had driven this frail creature to their door. The heavy oak door of the cabin slammed shut, instantly cutting off the deafening howl of the Montana blizzard. Inside, the air was thick with the comforting scent of burning cedar and aged leather. Elias Thorne, his broad shoulders covered in a dusting of white powder, gently laid Clara's frail, trembling body on a thick woolen rug near the stone fireplace. She was barely conscious, her lips tinged with a dangerous shade of blue, her frostbitten hands still stubbornly clutching that worn canvas bag to her chest. Elias moved with the silent, efficient grace of a man who had spent his life in life-or-death situations. He quickly draped a heavy thermal blanket over her shivering frame and turned to stoke the dying embers into a roaring fire. It was then that Elias witnessed something that made him freeze entirely. Kodiak, his 110-pound sable German shepherd, stepped forward from the shadows. Kodiak was a military working dog, a highly trained canine operator whose entire existence had been conditioned for extreme vigilance, perimeter defense, and neutralizing threats. To anyone else, Kodiak was a terrifying weapon of war, aloof and perpetually on guard. But right now, the massive predator did something completely out of character. He let out a soft, high-pitched whine, a sound of deep, instinctual empathy. Slowly, deliberately, the great dog approached the freezing old woman. He didn't sniff her for weapons or assess her as a trespasser. Instead, Kodiak circled once and then lay down heavily, curling his massive, muscular body directly against Clara's side. He tucked his warm snout under her chin, offering his own radiating body heat to fight off the frost creeping through her veins. Elias stood by the hearth, completely stunned. He had not seen this level of pure, unbridled gentleness from his canine partner since their darkest days deployed in the mountains of Afghanistan. It was as if Kodiak recognized that Clara was not an intruder, but a fellow wounded soul in desperate need of a pack. While peace and unexpected warmth blossomed inside the sanctuary of the log cabin, a very different kind of fire was burning outside in the freezing dark. Deputy Marcus Vance was finally nearing the edge of the tree line. Every step through the thigh-deep snow was an agonizing battle against the elements. But Vance was propelled forward by a toxic, blinding mixture of pride and ambition. To understand Vance, you must understand the invisible chain around his neck. He was a young man, only 26, but his sharp, handsome features were often twisted into a sneer of perpetual dissatisfaction. He hadn't joined the police force to protect the innocent. He wore the badge because he craved the authority it granted him. Lately, that authority was under intense scrutiny. Mayor Richard Sterling, a wealthy, impatient politician obsessed with turning the rugged town into a pristine, gentrified resort for rich tourists, had been breathing down the police department's neck. "Clean up the streets," the mayor had ordered, his tone dripping with disdain for the homeless and the struggling. Vance had taken that order to heart. His arrogance had completely clouded his reason, stripping away the empathy that should have been the foundation of his oath. He didn't care that Clara was an old woman caught in a lethal storm. To him, she was a stain on his record, a defiant piece of trash that was making him look weak. Gasping for breath, his uniform soaked and freezing, Vance broke through the dense pine trees and saw the warm orange glow of Elias's cabin. His jaw set into a hard, unforgiving line. He marched onto the wooden porch, his heavy tactical boots thudding aggressively against the planks. Inside, Elias was just pouring a cup of hot water from a cast-iron kettle. He wanted nothing more than to preserve the profound, quiet peace of his isolated refuge. He had retreated to these woods, specifically to escape the loud, demanding, and violent world of men. But that desire for sanctuary was instantly shattered. "Sheriff's Department," Vance roared, pounding his freezing fists violently against the thick oak door. The heavy wood rattled under his blows. "I know you're in there. Open this door immediately. You are harboring a fugitive." Elias did not move. He glanced down at Clara, who was finally beginning to stop shivering, safely cocooned in Kodiak's warmth. The veteran's jaw tightened. He knew the law, but he also knew the difference between right and wrong. Sending a frail, 72-year-old woman out into a blizzard with a hostile deputy was a death sentence. Elias remained perfectly silent, choosing to let the howling wind be the only answer the deputy received. Outside, the silence from within the cabin felt like a direct insult to Vance's ego. His authority was being challenged, his face flushed hot with a sudden, uncontrollable rage. He was cold, he was exhausted, and he was absolutely furious that a homeless vagrant and whoever owned this cabin were making a fool out of him. The desperation to assert his dominance completely overtook whatever shred of professional discipline he had left. "I said come out here right now, or I will use force," Vance screamed into the storm, his voice cracking with hysteria. When the heavy door remained stubbornly closed, Vance's pride snapped. Blinded by the swirling snow and his own inflated sense of power, he unholstered his 9mm service weapon. With a trembling, furious hand, he pointed the barrel toward the dark, storm-filled sky and pulled the trigger. Bang! The gunshot was deafening. It tore through the pristine silence of the ancient forest, echoing off the snow-covered pines with a sharp, violent crack that seemed to shatter the very atmosphere. Vance stood there, chest heaving, his weapon smoking in the freezing air, foolishly believing that this display of lethal power would force submission. But he had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. Inside the cabin, Clara did not flinch. Perhaps she was too weak, or perhaps her shattered mind had already survived horrors much louder than a single pistol shot. She only clutched her canvas bag tighter against Kodiak's fur. But for Elias and Kodiak, the sound of gunfire changed everything in an instant. The warm, peaceful sanctuary vanished. Kodiak's ears pinned flat against his skull. The gentle companion was gone, instantly replaced by the lethal canine operator. A deep, terrifying rumble built in the dog's chest as he rose from Clara's side, his amber eyes locking onto the wooden door with territorial fury. Beside him, Elias Thorne's posture shifted entirely. The weary hermit faded away, and the cold, calculated presence of a Tier 1 Navy SEAL emerged from the shadows. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm Vance had just awakened inside. The echo of a gunshot in the deep woods does not fade quickly. It hangs in the freezing air, a violent intrusion that silences even the howling winter wind for a fraction of a second. I have heard many sounds out here in the Montana wilderness in my 55 years, but nothing shatters the sanctity of nature quite like the crack of a 9mm pistol fired in arrogance. Before the brass casing even hit the snow-covered porch, the heavy oak door of the cabin violently burst open. It didn't just swing, it was thrown back with the kind of force that splinters wood. And from the warm, orange-lit interior, a shadow launched itself into the blizzard. It was Kodiak. I told you before about this dog. 110 pounds of sable-coated muscle, bred and trained for the darkest corners of human warfare. He didn't bark. A barking dog is a warning. A silent dog is a weapon. Kodiak flew across the porch like a black ghost, hitting Deputy Vance squarely in the chest with the kinetic force of a freight train. Vance, the arrogant young deputy, who just seconds ago felt like the master of the universe, crumbled instantly. He hit the icy wooden planks hard, the breath driven from his lungs, his service weapon flying from his trembling grip and disappearing into a deep snowbank. Kodiak stood over him, pinning the man to the frozen ground. The dog's massive paws planted firmly on Vance's chest, his thick jaws hovering mere inches from the deputy's throat. A low, terrifying vibration, a growl that you feel in your bones before you actually hear it, rolled from the dog's chest. Kodiak didn't bite. He didn't need to. His dominance was absolute. Then, Elias stepped out into the storm. He didn't wear a coat, seemingly impervious to the biting cold. In his hands, he held a tactical rifle, the barrel angled sharply downward in a low ready position. Elias's eyes, usually haunted by the unpredictable ghosts of his PTSD, were now terrifyingly clear and focused. They were the eyes of a Tier 1 Navy SEAL who had just found an active, hostile threat on his perimeter. He looked down at the pathetic, thrashing figure of the deputy trapped under his dog. "Call him off!" Vance screamed, his voice cracking, completely stripped of his former bravado. The young man's face, usually set in an entitled sneer, was contorted in pure, primal terror. "I am an officer of the law. Get this monster off me!" Elias didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You fired a weapon on my porch, deputy," Elias said, his tone colder than the ice beneath their feet. "You fired to threaten a dying woman. You don't have authority here. You just have fear." Desperate, panicked, and humiliated, Vance thrashed wildly underneath the massive weight of the German Shepherd. He wanted to regain some semblance of control, some shred of his shattered pride. As his heavy, snow-caked boot kicked out blindly in the struggle, it struck something resting near the doorframe. It was Clara's faded canvas bag. When Elias had rushed out to scoop her frozen body from the storm moments earlier, the old woman's frost-bitten fingers had been too weak to hold it, and the bag had dropped onto the porch boards. I need to tell you about that bag, my friends. It was entirely unremarkable on the outside, stained, fraying at the seams, the kind of battered luggage you would expect a vagrant to carry. But inside, it held the entire archive of a shattered life. Years ago, when the bank foreclosed on Clara's home, when the crushing weight of unpaid bills and the cold machinery of society forced her out onto the unforgiving streets, she had left behind the furniture, the dishes, and the clothes. She had only taken what her heart could not survive without. It was the only tangible proof of her history. Vance's frantic kick sent the bag tumbling across the planks. Its worn clasp broke, and the contents spilled out onto the snow-dusted porch. There were no valuables, no money, no trash. Instead, tumbling into the bitter white snow, were two tightly folded, perfectly triangular flags. The bold crimson, the stark white, the deep blue field of stars. They were burial flags. the sacred, heavy cotton draped over the caskets of fallen American soldiers. Elias Thorne froze. The tactical precision, the cold anger, the defensive posture, it all evaporated in an instant. The breath hitched in the veteran's throat. Every combat soldier knows the profound, devastating weight of that folded triangle. To see one is a tragedy. To see two, clutched in the meager belongings of a homeless, freezing woman, was a revelation that brought the hardened seal to a complete standstill. Clara was not just a vagrant, she was a Gold Star mother, a woman who had sacrificed 2 sons to the very same battlefields that had broken Elias's own mind. 2 boys who had died in the uniform, while their mother was left to freeze on the streets of a town that had completely forgotten her. The hostile, violent atmosphere on the porch completely dissolved, replaced by a suffocating, sacred silence. Even the howling blizzard seemed to quiet down out of respect. Elias lowered his rifle completely. He gave a sharp, single click of his tongue. Kodiak immediately ceased his growling. The highly disciplined dog lifted his massive head, stepped off the trembling deputy, and moved to sit loyally at Elias's side, though his amber eyes never left Vance. Vance scrambled backward, gasping for air, his face pale and flushed with intense shame. He looked at the heavy rifle in Elias's hand, then down at the 2 folded flags resting in the snow, and finally realized the sheer magnitude of his cowardice. He had drawn his gun and fired at a mother of fallen heroes. The arrogant badge he wore felt suddenly heavy and entirely unearned. "Get off my land," Elias whispered. The words were not a shout. They were a definitive, unbreakable command from a man who had seen too much death. Vance didn't say a word. Stripped of his ego, his arrogance shattered into a million pathetic pieces, the deputy scrambled to his feet. He stumbled off the porch, tripping through the snowdrifts, and disappeared back into the blinding whiteout of the storm, leaving his pride buried in the ice behind him. Elias did not watch him go. The veteran dropped his rifle to the wooden floor. He fell to his knees on the freezing porch, his bare, scarred hands gently, almost reverently, reaching for the 2 flags. He brushed the snowflakes from the heavy fabric with the utmost care, treating them like holy relics. He gathered the flags, placed them carefully back into the worn canvas bag, and stood up. He walked back inside the warm cabin, shutting the heavy door against the storm. Clara was awake now, lying on the thick rug by the fire. The color was slowly returning to her pale cheeks, and her tired, weathered eyes watched him weakly. Elias walked over to her. The large, heavily scarred soldier knelt gently beside the frail old woman. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand explanations or offer hollow pity. He simply placed the canvas bag softly into her trembling hands. As her fingers wrapped around the thick fabric of her son's flags, she looked up into Elias's eyes. In that silent, heavy exchange, an invisible, unbreakable bond was forged. 2 strangers, deeply wounded by the exact same wars, abandoned by the exact same world, had finally found each other in the dark. The winter up here in the high country doesn't just freeze the earth, my friends. It locks you in with whatever demons you carry. For weeks, the bitter whiteout wrapped around the Bitterroot Valley, severing the small town of Pine Ridge from Elias Thorne's isolated cabin. But before we look inside that snow-buried sanctuary, we must look at a man left alone with his own reflection. Back in town, the consequences of arrogance were rapidly catching up to Deputy Marcus Vance. Sheriff Thomas Holden, a stout man in his late 50s, with a face weathered like old saddle leather and a moral compass that pointed dead true, had immediately stripped Vance of his badge and sidearm. Holden was a lawman who built his career on community respect, not fear, and discharging a weapon at a harmless elder was an unforgivable breach of that trust. Placed on indefinite, unpaid suspension pending a psychological evaluation, Vance found himself confined to the suffocating quiet of his dimly lit apartment. Stripped of his authority, the young man's inflated ego finally collapsed, leaving behind a gnawing, agonizing guilt. Desperate to understand the magnitude of his mistake, Vance logged into the municipal and military archives. He pulled up Clara's file, tracing the ashes of the house fire that took her home, until he found the military records of her 2 fallen sons, Thomas and Michael. As Vance read the glowing text on his screen, his blood ran completely cold. The boys were killed in action during a brutal firefight in the Korengal Valley of Afghanistan. It was the exact same cursed, blood-soaked mountain range where Elias Thorne had earned his deepest physical and psychological scars. The revelation struck Vance like a physical blow to the chest. He had drawn his weapon and fired at the mother of the very men who had bled into the same foreign dirt as the man he was trying to intimidate. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, the blizzard raged on, barricading the heavy-timbered log cabin from the rest of the world behind towering 8-foot snowdrifts. Yet, inside those thick wooden walls, a profound and quiet thaw was taking place. As Clara's fragile body recovered from the brink of hypothermia, she did not cower in the corner or succumb to the trauma of the storm. Instead, she revealed the indestructible resilience of a mother who had already weathered the end of her world. Clara began to move around the dusty, neglected corners of Elias's self-imposed prison with a quiet, purposeful grace. She found old, forgotten rations in the pantry, flour, oats, and canned goods, and began to cook. Soon, the cold, lifeless cabin was filled with the forgotten, comforting aroma of baked bread and warm stew. Kodiak, the fierce, combat-hardened canine warrior, completely dropped his guard. He trailed behind Clara like a massive, sable-coated shadow, happily accepting small scraps of meat and resting his heavy, broad head softly on her lap while she sat knitting by the crackling fire. Elias watched them from his worn leather armchair, a cup of black coffee warming his scarred hands. For years, the veteran had been subconsciously desperate for a sliver of peace to soothe his ravaged mind, living in a constant state of hypervigilance. Clara, in turn, possessed a massive, hollow space in her chest, a desperate, aching desire to pour her maternal love into someone who needed it, just as her boys once did. In the silent, snowed-in cabin, an unspoken agreement was formed. But trauma, my friends, does not surrender easily. It waits in the shadows of your mind for a moment of weakness. Late one Tuesday night, the temperature outside plummeted dramatically. The freezing wind shrieked down the stone chimney, a high, piercing sound that perfectly mimicked the terrifying whistle of falling mortars. In his sleep, Elias was ripped violently back to the Korengal Valley. He was trapped in the burning, twisted fuselage of a downed transport chopper, choking on ash and blood, the deafening screams of his lost brothers ringing in his ears. Elias began to thrash violently on his narrow cot, his powerful fists striking the wooden frame. He roared in absolute, primal terror, his eyes squeezed shut against a waking nightmare, completely trapped in a war that had never really ended for him. An incredibly dangerous energy filled the room. Waking a combat veteran mid-flashback can be lethal. Clara did not run from the massive, dangerous soldier. She did not scream or call for help. She simply pulled her worn shawl over her shoulders and walked steadily to his bedside. Kodiak was already there, acting precisely on his specialized training. The massive dog climbed onto the mattress, pressing his heavy, calming weight firmly across Elias's thrashing legs, a deep pressure therapy technique designed to tether the soldier's panicked mind back to the physical world. Clara knelt softly beside the bed, showing no fear of the violent thrashing. She reached out her fragile, veined hands and firmly grasped Elias's broad, sweat-drenched shoulders. She didn't shake him, she simply held him, providing a steady, unshakable anchor. And then, her voice cut through the phantom gunfire in his mind. It was a soft, trembling, but beautiful melody, an old, familiar lullaby she used to sing to Thomas and Michael when the summer thunderstorms frightened them decades ago. The gentle, rhythmic hum of her voice wrapped around the broken seal like a protective shield. Slowly, the horrific, bloody visions began to dissolve. The thrashing ceased. Elias gasped for air, his chest heaving as his eyes flew open to see the warm, flickering firelight, the deep, steady gaze of his canine partner, and the tear-streaked, deeply tender face of a mother who understood his exact, unspoken pain. The nightmare was gone. In that quiet, sacred moment, the cold, isolated fortress had finally melted into a true home. Two completely shattered souls, abandoned by the society that had asked for their greatest sacrifices, had found the exact missing pieces required to heal each other. My friends, if you live long enough in the Bitterroot Valley, you learn that the thaw of spring is never just a change in the weather. It is a resurrection. The thick, suffocating ice that held the Montana wilderness captive for months finally begins to fracture. The rivers swell with rushing, triumphant water, washing away the dead wood of winter. And just as the land surrenders to the warmth of the sun, the ice around Elias Thorne's heart finally began to break. The profound healing within that isolated log cabin did not just keep Clara alive. It breathed a second life into the hardened Navy SEAL. For years, Elias had hidden from the world, convinced that his shattered mind made him unfit for human connection. But Clara's gentle presence, her quiet humming by the hearth, and her absolute refusal to fear his shadows had fundamentally changed him. With her steady encouragement, Elias made a decision that would have been impossible a season ago. On a crisp Tuesday morning, He loaded Kodiak into the passenger seat of his battered truck and drove down the mountain, not to hide, but to connect. He drove straight to the local Veterans of Foreign Wars post. Walking through those doors was the hardest mission Elias had faced since the Korengal Valley. The VFW hall was a dimly lit, wood-paneled room smelling of old coffee and quiet camaraderie. It was there that he met Harlan Miller. Harlan was the post commander, a 68-year-old Vietnam veteran with a thick, silver mustache, a barrel chest, and a left hand missing 2 fingers from a mortar blast decades ago. Harlan was a man whose boisterous, booming laugh could put anyone at ease, but his eyes held the deep, knowing empathy of someone who had survived his own private hell. When Elias walked in, tense and guarded with the massive sable German Shepherd by his side, Harlan didn't ask intrusive questions. He simply poured a mug of black coffee, slid it across the counter, and nodded at the empty stool beside him. For the first time in years, Elias sat among men who understood the weight of the uniform. He stepped out of his fortress of isolation and finally began to reintegrate into the world of the living. A few days later, the spring sun shone brightly over the town of Pine Ridge. Elias drove Clara down into the valley to restock their dwindling supplies. The town square was bustling with life, locals shaking off the winter gloom, carrying groceries, and chatting on the sidewalks. As Elias walked beside Clara, his posture was rigid. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd, constantly assessing the perimeter. He remembered vividly how this town had treated her, how they had looked right through her, treating a grieving mother like an invisible nuisance. He walked with Kodiak perfectly healed at his left side, his broad frame unconsciously shielding Clara from the judging stares of the townsfolk. He was fiercely determined to protect her honor at all costs. They had just stepped out of the local general store, Clara clutching a small paper bag of fresh apples, when the crowd ahead of them suddenly parted. Standing dead center in the middle of the bustling square was Marcus Vance. The former deputy looked completely different. He was no longer wearing the crisp, authoritative uniform that had once fueled his cruel arrogance. Dressed in a faded canvas jacket and simple denim jeans, Vance looked older, stripped of his ego, and physically weighed down by an immense, crushing guilt. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights. When Elias saw him, the SEAL's jaw clenched into a hard line. Kodiak immediately sensed his master's tension. The massive canine stepped forward, placing himself protectively in front of Clara, a low, warning rumble vibrating deep in his throat. The atmosphere in the square turned instantly suffocating. Shoppers froze. Conversations died. Everyone braced for a violent confrontation. But Vance did not raise his voice. He did not puff out his chest. Instead, he took a slow, trembling step forward and slowly took off his cap, holding it tightly in his hands. He lowered his head, refusing to meet Elias's hardened gaze, and looked directly at the frail, elderly woman he had nearly killed in the snow. "Ma'am," Vance's voice broke, carrying clearly across the silent square. He took a deep, shuddering breath, turning slightly so that the entire gathered crowd could hear him. "For months, I thought I was protecting this town. I thought I was keeping our streets clean, but all I did was blind myself to my own cruelty." Vance turned his gaze to the stunned townsfolk. "We all walked past her. We all turned our heads. We called her a nuisance, but none of us knew who she really was." Vance turned back to Clara, tears finally spilling over his exhausted eyes. "Her name is Clara, and decades ago, after a fire took everything she owned, she gave the only thing she had left to this country, her sons, Thomas and Michael. They died in the Korengal Valley, wearing the flag we all claim to respect. She is a Gold Star mother. She sacrificed everything, and in return, we left her to freeze in the dark. I left her to freeze in the dark." A collective, audible gasp rippled through the crowd. The revelation struck the town of Pine Ridge like a physical blow. The baker who had once shooed her away from his awning dropped his hands. The mothers who had pulled their children away from her on the sidewalks covered their mouths in horror. The profound shame and realization washed over the community in an instant. Vance dropped to one knee, right there on the cobblestone, bowing his head in front of Clara, completely surrendering his pride to ask for a forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. Slowly, the townspeople began to step forward. The indifference that had plagued Pine Ridge was shattered, replaced by a desperate, overwhelming need to make amends. The owner of the local inn rushed forward, her eyes brimming with tears, offering Clara a permanent, warm room free of charge. Others offered hot meals, fresh clothes, and a revered place in the very heart of the community. They reached out, wanting to embrace the hero's mother they had so deeply wronged. Elias stood tense, ready to intervene, but he waited to see what Clara would do. Clara looked at Vance kneeling on the ground. She looked at the tearful, remorseful faces of the people offering her the comfort and security she had been denied for years. Her weathered face softened into a beautiful, serene smile. There was no anger in her heart, only the profound peace of a woman who had already found what she was looking for. She gently reached out and rested her frail hand on Elias's strong, scarred forearm. Then, she looked down at Kodiak, who immediately leaned his massive sable head against her leg, his tail wagging softly. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice fragile but carrying a quiet, undeniable strength. She looked at the innkeeper, then at the rest of the crowd. "Your offers are very kind, but I don't need a room in town." She smiled warmly, her grip tightening slightly on Elias's arm. "I already have a home, and I am already with my family." With a grace that left the entire town standing in reverent silence, Clara turned. Guided by the unwavering presence of the combat veteran and flanked by the loyal, massive frame of the German Shepherd, she walked away from the crowded square, heading back to the quiet, snow-melted sanctuary of the woods. Time is a river, my friends, and out here in the wild, you learn to let it carry you rather than fighting the current. Many warm, peaceful winters had passed over the Bitterroot Valley since that fateful blizzard, each one further softening the harsh edges of the world they had all built together. The profound impact of Clara's presence had rippled far beyond the wooden walls of Elias Thorne's isolated cabin, flowing all the way down into the heart of Pine Ridge. Down in the valley, Marcus Vance was no longer the arrogant, hollow young deputy who had once chased an old, freezing woman through the snow. Now in his mid-30s, Sheriff Vance wore his badge with a quiet, solemn dignity. The sharp, aggressive angles of his youth had smoothed out, his hair graying slightly at the temples, and his eyes, once clouded by blind ambition, now held the deep, steady empathy of a man who truly understood the weight of his office. He had become a leader who governed with immense compassion, known throughout the county for resolving disputes with a calm, listening ear rather than the threat of a firearm. The invisible legacy of a Gold Star mother's forgiveness had fundamentally rewritten his soul, turning him into the true protector he had originally sworn to be. But the seasons must turn, and the autumn leaves must eventually fall. Clara's departure from this world was not marked by violence or the roaring, terrifying winds of a storm, but by the gentle, fading light of a peaceful sunset. She passed away quietly in her sleep, her frail, weathered hand resting softly in the strong, scarred grip of the former Navy SEAL, while Kodiak, the massive sable German Shepherd, rested his heavy chin gently across her chest. Her final breath was a quiet sigh of absolute contentment, leaving behind a profound silence in the cabin that was both beautiful and utterly heartbreaking. The desire to honor the woman who had brought the spring back into their shattered lives was a heavy, sacred duty for Elias and Kodiak. Sheriff Vance himself drove the lead vehicle of the small, deeply respectful procession that wound its way up the mountain, escorting the townspeople who had come to pay their final respects to the mother they had all learned to love. When the time came to lay Clara to rest on the small, quiet hill just behind the log cabin, beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient, watchful pine tree, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy, collective mourning. But as the townspeople slowly dispersed and the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon, the Bitterroot Valley, as if remembering its old, cruel nature, sent a bitter, biting wind sweeping down from the snow-capped peaks. The temperature plummeted rapidly, freezing the freshly turned earth. Elias, feeling the dangerous bite of the frost, gently tugged at Kodiak's heavy tactical collar, intending to lead the grieving dog back into the warmth of the cabin. But the 110-pound K9 operator, a creature who had always obeyed his master's every command with lightning precision, did something entirely unexpected. Kodiak planted his massive paws firmly into the freezing dirt and adamantly refused to move. He let out a low, mournful whimper, his amber eyes fixed intently on the mound of fresh soil, completely ignoring the freezing gusts that whipped fiercely at his thick fur. Standing there in the biting wind, Elias looked down at his loyal partner, and a profound realization washed over the battle-hardened veteran. He saw past the military training and the predatory muscle, looking directly into the deep, ancient emotional capacity of the animal. Kodiak did not just view Clara as a fragile human they had been tasked to protect. He saw her as the very heart of their pack. She was the mother who had shared her warmth, who had fed him scraps by the fire, and who had stroked his head when the world was dark. The dog was experiencing a grief just as complex and devastating as human sorrow, and he possessed his own sacred way of mourning. Elias slowly released his grip on the collar, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He understood that loyalty, in its purest, most untamed form, does not retreat when the cold sets in. Instead of forcing the dog inside, Elias turned and walked back to the cabin alone. He returned moments later carrying a thick, heavy woolen blanket and a thermos of hot coffee. The rugged, scarred Navy SEAL sat down heavily on the freezing ground right next to the freshly dug grave. He draped the heavy blanket over his own broad shoulders and extended it to cover the shivering, massive frame of the German Shepherd. Kodiak immediately curled his large body tightly against Elias's side, resting his snout directly over the center of the grave to warm the cold earth beneath him. For 3 consecutive days and 3 agonizingly cold nights, the 2 veterans of war held their ground on that hill. They did not abandon their post. As the snow began to gently fall, dusting the world in a quiet white shroud, the man and the dog maintained their silent, unbreakable vigil. They stood guard over the remarkable woman who had wandered out of a storm and pieced their broken souls back together, ensuring that the great mother of the forest would never, ever have to be alone in the dark again. As the embers of our campfire softly glow, I want us to take a quiet moment to reflect on what Clara, Elias, and Kodiak truly left behind. Out here in the wild, survival depends on the pack. But in our modern, everyday lives, we often forget that. We walk past strangers every single day. We see their worn clothes or their tired faces, but we almost never see the invisible, heavy burdens they carry in their hearts. We judge too quickly and listen too little. This story reminds us that true family is not always bound by blood. Sometimes family is found in the middle of a bitter storm, forged when broken souls decide to share their warmth. Kodiak did not care about human laws or societal status. He only saw a fragile mother who needed comfort, and he gave her his absolute loyalty, even beyond the grave. Animals have a profound way of showing us the purest form of grace, teaching us how to be better humans. If this journey touched your soul today, please share this video with someone who might need a reminder that there is still goodness in this world. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you believe in the unbroken loyalty of animals and the healing power of compassion, please type Amen below. It shows that we are all part of one great, understanding family. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel so we can keep this campfire burning and share more wild heart stories together. May the Great Spirit guide your path, and may God bless every single one of you and your loved ones listening tonight. Stay warm, be kind to one another, and I will see you on the next trail.